Hi, I'm Adam Porter, and this is Adam's Board Game Wales, a channel where we talk about games, different types of games, categorise games, but specifically look at mechanisms in games in relation to game design. Now, as somebody interested in game design myself, I'm often thinking about what sort of things haven't been done within a specific genre. What are common tropes within that genre? What are the things that seem familiar within that genre? Are there things that I can look at that I can either combine from other games in the genre, or maybe something completely new which hasn't been done? And that's where these categorized sort of lists really help me. And today I'm looking at two-player only games. So this is a bit of an exploration for me. What two-player only games are out there? What sort of mechanisms feature in these games? What works well, what doesn't? Why are they two-player only? Why couldn't they have more players in them? And what are the barriers that we meet when we try to design a two-player only game? So that's our sort of starting point, and I think the obvious sort of poster child for the two-player only games is the abstract strategy games. So we're talking chess and checkers or drafts in the UK. As a child, I was particularly intrigued by the game Camelot, which was an old sort of childhood game of my dad, and it's a really good abstract strategy game. I'm surprised we don't still see it around now. In fact, I haven't seen it anywhere for a long time. But more recently, modern games, we have the GIPF series. Now these are fantastic games. We've got GIPF and Dvon and Zertz and Punkt and Yinch and Tsar, and recently this new game Linked, or Link I think it's called. These are fantastic games. So in abstract strategy games, each player has a set of identical pieces, so we're both playing from a position of symmetry. Often the game is set up symmetrically, although not also. Sometimes there's some sort of randomized setup. But moves are entirely dictated by strategic and tactical decisions on the parts of the players. There's very rarely any randomness in these games, certainly not in the GIPF series. Other games which work along these similar lines, games like Onitama and Haloichiban, they tend to be very cerebral sort of games where players will sit back and take their time to think about their moves. And they're a quiet experience. We're not immersed by some heavy-handed sort of storytelling, thematic things put on top of the game. We're immersed by thinking about several moves ahead. How can we cut off our opponent? Often these games work on the basis of moving from one side of the board to the other, or connecting those sides of the board, or controlling an area of territory, or perhaps forming a linked chain of your own coloured pieces, maybe capturing an opponent's pieces. So those are the abstract strategy games. Great games for two. The reason they don't work so well with multiplayers, although there are examples of this, is because they are so cerebral. You tend to be thinking a lot, which means they're going to slow down with more than two players. And also the decision space gets much bigger. It's one thing to be able to predict several moves ahead what your single opponent might do, but once we get two or three opponents, that decision space becomes massive. A friend recently brought along to our local board game club a version of 3-player chess. Now, it sounded intriguing, but once you looked at the board, it was like one of those magic eye pictures. It looked weird. It made you feel nauseous. Sort of attractive, but really odd. And the players playing the game, they were pulling their hair out with so many choices, because the pieces are moving around and then they're branching off. And some of these games are best kept at 2-player. I think there's no doubt about that. And that's why traditionally they've always been so. So having dealt with the traditional abstract strategy games, number 9 on my list of 10 mechanisms used in 2-player games is your sort of sports type games. So if you think about sports, we have pool and snooker and darts, which are all often 2-player games. Within the board game realm, we have some dexterity games like Crokinole, which I think it's on that border of, is this a board game or not, or is it some other sort of leisure activity? But Crokinole is a fantastic game for two. It can be played in partnerships, but ultimately it's best as a 2-player head-to-head sort of battle. And then this moves out into other sort of dexterity games. The one that immediately comes to mind is the game Cube Quest, which is flicking these little plastic cubes, trying to knock your opponent's pieces off the board, but essentially at its core it's something very similar to a game like Crokinole. Number 8 on the list is traditional card games. So within this category we have probably the real sort of the first one that comes to mind when people ask you about what game should I play with my partner who doesn't like games, and that game is Lost Cities. Lost Cities feels very much like a traditional card game that could be played with a traditional deck of playing cards. Similar, well, not similar in terms of gameplay, but again a game that feels like you could play it with playing cards is the game Haggis, which is an excellent trick-taking climbing game. So the game Teach You is a 4-player game that's played in partnerships. Haggis is a 2-player or 3-player, but I think it's at its best at 2. It's a trick-taking experience, quite a sophisticated one. I think it's an excellent design. Lost Cities. Now, Lost Cities is Rainer Knizia's game where we position out coloured cards. So we're laying them out alongside a particular slot on a board. So we're laying out red cards next to the red slot and white cards next to the white slot, and we're trying to score high in each of those categories. Now, in doing so, we're depriving the opposing player of those same cards because we're using a shared deck here. It's got aspects of lots of other types of 2-player only games in it, and I'm going to keep coming back to Lost Cities because it really does incorporate the best of many of the other 2-player only games, which I think is why it becomes the sort of poster child for the couples game. So, first up, looks like Lost Cities, plays a bit like Lost Cities, but it falls into a different category. This is Battle Line and other games of its ilk. So we're now into number 7, which is the area majority games. So here we have Battle Line and its more recent incarnation of Schotten Totten. This is where, again, we have a series of placements, but in these instances, when we play cards, we're trying to score a higher total on our side of the board than the person on the other side. So we're trying to have sort of majority control of that particular slot, unlike in Lost Cities, where it doesn't really, our scoring is not affected by what the player has on the other side. So in Battle Line or Schotten Totten, we're playing poker hands on these different slots, so we're trying to take control of 3 adjacent slots or 5 slots across the board. Now this is a little bit of a staple in 2-player only genre, with games like Balloon Cup, or now called Pinata in its most recent editions. This has a very similar mechanism. Libelud released a game called Nautilus several years ago, which is very similar. A lovely little game. Jolly and Roger was a recent game using this mechanism. Again, playing cards, trying to take control of those spaces. And the darling of Essen Spiel Convention 2016, Hanamikoji, which is just now making its way out into distribution and into the wider sort of public consciousness. Hanamikoji, stunning, streamlined use of this mechanism with beautiful artwork. I couldn't recommend that one highly enough. This, of course, again, not just a 2-player only thing. It has been used in bigger board games. Games like Smash Up uses something similar, where we're trying to take control of these different territories. Can get a bit clunky with more players, take a little bit longer, a little bit more calculation involved, much more table space required. Bruno Catala toyed with it with the game Chicago Poker. That was quite a nice little game using hexagons, and you're putting cards alongside the different sides of those hexes. And Blood Bowl Team Manager is a very good game which can go up to multiplayer, but still best with 2, I think, in terms of taking control of those different sides of the spaces. Once we blow this up into a big board game, area majority can become something as huge as the game Twilight Struggle, which is a massively popular, heavy sort of strategic game, pretty complex sort of stuff. And this brings us into our next category, in that the 2-player only games often feature asymmetry between the players. That's obviously going to make things a little bit more exciting, isn't it? If we don't just have that standard setup, as I mentioned, with the abstract strategy games, but actually we have different abilities on either side of the coin. So Twilight Struggle has this, absolutely, each player has a totally different set of cards that work for them in different ways. Another game, a two-player only game, arguably they put on the box that you can play it with more, but only really by splitting the moves between the different players within your team. So it's a two-team game. And this is Star Wars Rebellion. Now for me, Star Wars Rebellion, I mean, it's not really up my street anyway, but it has a few little the similar issues to Twilight Struggle in that really, in order to play it effectively, you need to know those decks of cards. You need to know what's going on in your opponent's deck, what's going on in your deck, what cards are likely to come up. And so there's quite a lot of learning involved. Your first game, you're going to be destroyed if you're playing against someone who's experienced with the game. And only once you get to know the decks are things going to become a little bit more easy going. And that's true of a lot of the asymmetric games. You need to not only know your powers, you need to know the opponent's powers too, which is why they work quite nicely when they're stripped back to something a little bit lighter. Bruno Catala's game Raptor is a particularly good example. Excellent, Bruno Catala and Bruno Fiduti, I should say, for Raptor. This is an excellent two-player asymmetric game where one player is playing a family of dinosaurs, a mother and babies, and the other player is playing a scientist trying to capture those babies. But both players have a totally different deck of cards, a totally different series of actions. But because there's only 9 of them, it's really easy to learn the other player's actions at the beginning of the game and have some idea of what they're going to do. So this works particularly well. Bruno Catala also made the asymmetric games Mr. Jack in New York, Phantom of the Opera, where again you need to learn the actions of all the different pieces, but the pieces are available to both players. And this brings us into category 5 on my list, which is that two-player only games tend to lend themselves to deduction games, where you're trying to work out what your opponent's doing, where they're going, where they're positioned. Maybe it's a hidden movement game. And Mr. Jack is a great deduction game. Of course, going back to our childhoods, we'll remember the game Guess Who, a standard 2-player deduction game that's going to be very tricky to incorporate into a wider sort of 3 or 4-player game. Rebellion, Star Wars Rebellion, already mentioned, that's a deduction game too. And if we're looking at deduction, the game Scotland Yard, which I played a lot as a child. It's not a 2-player game. In fact, it's not even, I don't think on the box it even says that you can play it with 2. But really, it's an excellent game to play with 2. And when you're playing it with more than 2, you're essentially just splitting the actions between a group of players. It's one versus a team. It could be a 2-player experience. This gets blown up into bigger games like Letters from Whitechapel and Fury of Dracula, and I think the whole thing gets a little bit bloated and the fun gets diluted for me when other games have done that. Now, going the other way, so taking a big board game and reducing it to something 2-player is also something that we've commonly seen from big designers and big publishers. And so this is my category number 4, which I'm calling reduced board games. And Uwe Rosenberg is the particular sort of example here. So Uwe Rosenberg has put out a range of games through Mayfair and Lookout. So we've got a 2-player version of Le Havre called The Inland Port. We've got a 2-player version of Agricola called All Creatures Big and Small. I believe we have one coming for Caverna, a 2-player version. Now these are essentially games that could be multiplayer, but they're reduced to 2-player to fit into a small box, a small time frame, simplified rules, and then be sold on that basis. These games don't particularly interest me because I like their bigger counterparts, and it feels like probably an interesting design choice. I can imagine doing that, taking a big game and then thinking, how can I really strip this back, strip out the components, make the box smaller, make the rules simpler. It's probably a good design thing, but many of these bigger games that I've got behind me, they work perfectly well at 2-player anyway. So I consider those a sort of oddity amongst this genre. Other examples would be Fields of Arle even, Uwe Rosenberg's massive game. Now in that case I can see the logic. You've got something enormous where there's going to be loads of thinking, loads of downtime. If you play it with multiplayers, it's going to go on for hours. yeah, why not say this is a 2-player only game, albeit I know that in that game there was a 3-player expansion brought out. In fact, one of my favourite Uwe Rosenberg games is At the Gates of Loyang, and I will only play that at 2-player. It does go up to 3 or 4, but really to me it feels like we're essentially doing a solitaire puzzle, and there's a little bit of interaction in the card draft in the middle of the game, but essentially I'm playing alone. I don't want to wait for 3 other players to take their quite long turns before it comes back to me, whereas at 2-player it's quite nice. We're playing together, it's quite casual, a little bit of interaction. So I can see the logic in some of these games in making them 2-player only before they get unwieldy. Other examples would be Star Realms, a 2-player only deck builder, no reason why it needs to be 2-player only, and in fact you can increase it by adding in more decks to more players. And Carcassonne the Castle, the 2-player only version of Carcassonne. Again, it's just a version of Carcassonne, but it just happens to work for 2. Quite like it, but again, it just feels like reduced for the purposes purely of sort of marketing and publishing. Interesting design choices there, but why not just play Carcassonne 2-player? This takes us to category number 3, which I'm calling army games, but essentially we're talking war games, miniature games, skirmish type games. I've played a few of these over time, a little bit of Blood Bowl. I like Blood Bowl very much, mainly nostalgia reasons. I mean, it is very luck dependent and it doesn't really fit with the other style of games that I like, but as a child I enjoyed it very much. Played a bit of Warhammer 40k at one point in my gaming life, quite enjoyed that. These are very much 2-player games. It would get a bit odd once you start to stick other players into the mix. It's one army or one group of models battling against another, trying to kill them or trying to take territory or move into their spaces, or in the case of Blood Bowl, trying to get the ball into the other side of the pitch. We have games like Memoir 44. I like Imperial Assault, the skirmish game in that. I'm not so keen on campaigns generally and scenario-based games, but one-off battles, me versus them, it's quite exciting. So war games, army, skirmish games fit quite well into 2-player only sort of territory. Number 2 on the list, collectible games. Very closely related to the army games in that often a lot of the work is done before the game starts. So we're collecting a series of cards or a series of miniatures, and then we're making an army which we're going to take, or a deck of cards which we're going to take into that particular battle. And so we see games like Magic the Gathering and Android Netrunner and Warhammer 40k, as I've mentioned. And recently I've been playing a little bit of Star Wars Destiny, just sort of dabbling with that. This is the first time I've ever been buying booster packs, random boosters, not knowing what I'm getting. Found some excitement in it. Pretty soon the novelty wore off, although the game itself I think is pretty good. And there is some fun in building a simple little deck which you're then going to take up against your opponent. You see this in Imperial Assault as well. In fact, one of the things I find frustrating about the skirmish game is the fact I have to sit there, go through a bunch of cards and make a deck. I'm much more interested in getting out of the box and just playing, but you can't do that in that particular game. Number 1 on the list. So this is set collection and drafting. And you see this quite frequently in 2-player only games. When we talk about drafting in gaming, it's a bit of a confusing sort of term because it can mean a number of different things, but essentially we're borrowing the term drafting from sports. So in sports, classically I remember at school we used to play rounders, the sort of British equivalent to baseball, I suppose, and you would be standing on that sports field in a PE lesson, and you'd be dreading it, and then the best players, they would get to be the team captains. They'd come out to the front and then they would pick, right, I want you on my team. The other player would say, I want you on my team. And then some of us might be left till last, which I would have rather not been picked at all, frankly, than actually play. But there we are. You get picked last. This is a draft, and essentially it's what happens in some board games. And the term has been adopted by games like Seven Wonders and Sushi Go, meaning that when we have a deck of cards, a hand of cards, we take one, we play it and we pass the cards on, somebody else takes one, it gets passed on, so we're all selecting from that common pool. But it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be the pass and play sort of drafting. It can be a central pool of components where we pick from that central pool and add them to our own set. and so often these games feature set collection and different clever ways of drafting. Now, what you find when you look at a game like Seven Wonders or Sushi Go, although they do have two-player versions, they don't work very well. Some of the magic is lost when you're just passing the same set of cards back and forth between two players. So when a two-player version of Seven Wonders was created, it uses a totally different sort of draft where the cards are laid out on the table, and by taking certain cards you can access other ones, and it works quite well. It's quite a streamlined system, quite clean, not too many clunky rules. And then you see other games try and do the same, notably Bonanza Dust Duel that came out last year, taking this big sort of negotiation drafting game Bonanza and trying to make it into a two-player game, and the draft becomes really weird and complicated. Uwe Rosenberg tends to feature fairly complicated drafts. I like the fact that he experiments with them, but At the Gates of Loyang has a fairly weird card drafting system in it as well. So Bonanza Dust Duel, slightly clunky example, still fun. Seven Wonders Duel, fairly clean, streamlined example, works very well. But other examples of drafting in two-player games, the game Fungi or Morels, I think, is a different edition of it where we're collecting different mushrooms and forming sets. That's a lovely two-player game. The game Jaipur is an excellent two-player game. I mean, right up there with Battle Line and Lost Cities, where we're collecting sets and putting them together. And then even the game Patchwork, which I haven't mentioned yet because it's a bit of an oddity amongst all these other games that we've talked about. But Patchwork, we're drafting almost Tetris-style pieces and then putting them together to make a little puzzle on our board and try and hold this territory on our board, cover as much of it as possible in order to score points, or particularly to avoid negative points. Patchwork, excellent two-player game with a simple draft, also by Uwe Rosenberg. I mentioned Lost Cities again there, and earlier I said Lost Cities factors in many of these different things. It has an element of drafting, it has an element of set collection, it has a little bit of that, it's not quite the area majority thing, but it feels similar. It's got the traditional card game feel to it. It's got an attractive presentation, a small box, simple rules, and so it features a lot of these different mechanisms, which is why it just feels right as a two-player only game, and probably as the first one you're going to want to pick up if you're going to delve into this sort of world. Right, so that was a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through this particular sort of world of games. What do we gain from this? I guess the aim of it was to look at what's done often in two-player games, and therefore what could be done, what hasn't been done. If you look at the sort of list of the most popular two-player only games on Board Game Geek, it takes quite a long time before you go through that list, before you find anything that doesn't fit into these categories. I've never played the game Targi, but it looks fascinating. It doesn't look like just a reduced board game that could have loads more players. It looks like something unique. I don't know enough about it to kind of give you an overview, but can we do worker placement as a two-player only game without it just feeling like a reduced version of the bigger games? Can we do dice placement? What about simultaneous action selection? Well, I mean, Bruno Catala's tried a bit of that with Raptor and Haruichiban. What other games could we look at? How could an auction work with two players? What about a sort of a word game, like a Codenames type game, something like that going on, a party game around this sort of thing. That, this is what I'm interested in, is working out what hasn't been done, what needs to be done from here. How can we bring something fresh into this genre? Not that it's particularly a sort of overdone genre. I think there's plenty of scope for new stuff, and actually I could play deduction games like Mr. Jack all day long without keep coming out with those. That would be great. I'd like a few more of those. Anyway, there's just food for thought. Maybe I'll come back to this with some more thoughts another time. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Adam Porter. This is Adam's Board Game Wales. Please follow me on Twitter @BoardGameWales. Thank you very much for watching, and all the best.